Hello, and welcome to session 5 of the Ability Center of Greater Toledo's ADA seminar, Promoting Housing Justice from Barriers to Full Community Access for People with Disabilities. I'm here to introduce the seminar with George Thomas from the Fair Housing Center. I'm Katie Hunt-Thomas. I'm the Director of Advocacy for the Ability Center of Greater Toledo, and I'm looking forward to this session. This session is the 5th of 6 sessions. So if you haven't already, I recommend that you take a look at the seminar website, which will be, the link will be in the chat. Our sessions are captioned. If you need captioning, just click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. And because we have these approved for continuing legal education credits, there will be a poll halfway through. When you see the poll, just click on it and move on. So the next session is a panel discussion, Overcoming Barriers to Independent Living from the perspective of advocates with disabilities. And I'm going to turn this over to George to introduce our moderator.
Thanks so much. The Fair Housing Center is really glad and excited to be able to co-sponsor this ADA seminar with the Ability Center. And I'll go ahead and introduce our moderator without further ado. Valerie Fatica is a lifelong resident of Northwest Ohio. Valerie graduated from the University of Toledo College of Law in 2008 after receiving her undergraduate degree at Kent State University. She held a private practice for 14 years, focusing primarily on family law and Title III ADA litigation. From 2016 through 2022, she also worked part-time as a staff attorney at Legal Aid of Western Ohio. In June of 2022, she was hired as the City of Toledo's first disability manager. In that role, Valerie serves as more than just the Title II ADA coordinator. The disability manager is responsible for advancing strategic policies and programs for people with disabilities in the City of Toledo and advising the mayor's office and city departments on the needs of residents with disabilities. Valerie, thank you so much for being here. We have so much in common. I used to work at LAWO and we graduated from the same law school, and I'm really excited about your new position at disability manager. So thank you for being our moderator.
Thank you. And thank you, George. So we're going to go ahead and get right into introducing our lovely panel. And I think just to kind of keep things moving, I'm going to call on you just like law school. So let's go ahead and start with Katie. Go ahead and introduce yourself and why access to housing is important to you.
So hi, everyone. My name is Katie Shelley. I am the manager of access initiatives at the Toledo Museum of Art, but I am also a person with a disability and I am a homeowner. So, making sure that I was able to find my own home that was accessible to me as a person with a physical disability. I'm a wheelchair user. It was very important to me. And also disability advocacy is very important to me, not only in my position at the Toledo Museum of Art, but I formerly used to work in the advocacy program at the Ability Center. So it's really come full circle that I'm here today and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. And we'll go next to Adrienne.
Hi, my name is Adrienne Bell. I am a person with a disability as well. I sit on the board for the Ability Center. I currently have a home in Perrysburg, and accessible housing is important to me because at some point, you're probably going to know somebody that has a disability. In reality, 1 in 4 US adults live with a disability. So at some point in your life, you will either have a disability or know someone who has one. A disability, whether it's temporary, situational, or permanent, it can affect any of us at any time. In my personal journey, 2 things factored into wanting to have an accessible housing. One was the lifestyle that I wanted, which was to have a home to raise my children. And 2, the financial investment. Paying rent was not a good investment considering the lifestyle that I wanted to have. So, and I also wanted to capitalize on home value appreciation and property tax reduction. So thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Adrienne. And we'll go to Jeremy.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Bigelow. I'm Also a person with a disability. I have a C3, C4 spinal cord injury, so I have no function below my shoulders. So I use a power wheelchair day in and day out. I'm also on the board for the Ability Center, and accessible housing is very, very important to me, as you can imagine, being in a power wheelchair, being able to access, not just getting into a home, but accessing everything inside of a home. So I'll leave it there. I'm excited to be on this panel today, and thanks for the invite.
Thank you. So the next question is going to be for everyone, and I think unless somebody objects, we can probably go in the same order as you all introduced yourself. But the next question is, what's one major barrier in relation to housing that you have experienced in your life?
All right, so I'm assuming I'm going first, Valerie.
That's right, Katie, go ahead.
Okay. All right. So for me, one barrier that I faced in relation to housing, prior to owning my own home in Toledo, Ohio, I lived with my parents, and it was very difficult for me while I was looking for a house to find a house that was already made accessible for me as a wheelchair user. And so I knew that if I were to get my own house, I would have to make modifications in order to make the home more accessible for me. So that was a challenge, first in finding a house that I could feasibly within my budget afford, and then also afford the modifications for the home in order to make it accessible. So I have a ranch style home, but when I purchased the home, it had steps up to the front porch and steps off of the back deck. And I still can't get off of the back deck, but I was at least able to have a ramp built on the front of the home so that I'm able to get in the home. And then because it's all on one floor, I'm able to access all the rooms on the main floor, with the exception of my utility room. So all this to say, even though I found a home that works for me as a wheelchair user, it's still not the most accessible home for me. And eventually my goal would be to have my own house built. But in the interim, given what I could afford, making sure that I was able to find a reasonable home in the location that I wanted, which was Toledo, and making sure that I was able to afford the modifications were barriers, but also I was able to make it work.
Thank you.
Some of my barriers were, related to the financial aspect. So I was born with a hearing loss. So some of the things that I would need in a home would be some like flashing alerts for the smoke alarm, maybe some flashing lights for the doorbell, for example. So a majority of those kinds of devices were not installed at home. And so I knew that if I wanted to buy a home, I had to have a budget, set aside for those accessible technology equipment that I needed in order to live in a home in a safe environment. Making sure that not only was I safe, but that my family was safe. So that was a personal barrier that I experienced. On the other hand, as a caregiver to my mom, and I think in her situation, she was she was able to function. She's had a house for 50 years. And then more recently, as she has gotten older, she had needed some additional accessibility features. She's now in a wheelchair. And so then you're kind of in a situation of either do you try and move her from a home that she's been in for 50-some years into an apartment or something smaller that could be potentially accessible, or do you, basically redesign the home so that she can stay there? So those are some of the barriers that we've come across.
And as a follow-up, Adrienne, just as you mentioned, seeing a parent age, did that make you look at your own home and reconsider some of the things and possible barriers that might come up as you age?
Yes, absolutely. Luckily, the house that I purchased, and this was probably just a random lucky star, but somehow the house that I purchased it will grow as we age. So there is a one-story home. It's all on the first floor. So there's a lot of positive things about the home that I purchased. So I'm very lucky from that standpoint. If I would have bought some of the other houses that I was looking at the time, I would have felt totally different. I would have probably said to myself, this is a great home, potentially to raise my children, but at some point, I'm going to have to make the decision to either find a more accessible house down the road. As seniors, you're going to need accessible housing, especially if you don't want to move into assisted living kind of facilities. And so I would have thought very differently about it. But luckily in the house that I'm in, I feel like we can stay here for a lot longer period.
Thank you. Jeremy?
Valerie, I'm just going to have you go ahead and reiterate the question.
Sure. So the next question is, what's one major barrier in relation to housing that you may have experienced?
Well, I'll just start from day one. My accident, I was 26 years old. I was single, living in a rented condo down in Columbus. And when I had my car accident and became paralyzed, instantly all my family lives back here in Northwest Ohio. Everyone, my parents' homes, everyone lived in like a split level. Everything had major steps. Everything was narrow. So instantly, I was gone in hospitals for almost a year. But in that time, somehow it was put on my parents, in order for me to get out of the hospital, I had to have a better accessible house to get into and somewhat maneuver and around in. So the major barrier was just finding a house that I could get into without having to use ramps every day. And then having a room that was wide enough, big enough for the hospital bed, a wheelchair, and even trying to find something that maybe by the luck, anything that could resemble a roll-in shower, because usually bed baths is the only option if you can't find a roll-in shower, which more times than not, you will never find a roll-in shower in a home. So I think the biggest barrier is probably just finding a house that you can get into without a ramp, I would say is the number one barrier. Because even when my dad or my mom was going to look at a house, everything has at least 2 steps in it. So.
Thank you. Next, we're going to kind of split up some of the questions. So this next question, I'll start with you again, Jeremy. The question is, housing needs surveys have shown a need for more accessible housing in Ohio and locally. What does accessible housing mean for you? And have you found that need for more accessible housing to be true?
I would say absolutely that is true. I just recently built a house. I got married last year, and my wife and I, in the process of figuring out where we wanted to go and how we wanted to pursue that, was let's go look at houses. Maybe we'll find something. you can never, when you look for, try to find filters for finding a house that's accessible, everyone I think marks that it is accessible for some reason, but it never is. And houses aren't built, or even 10, 20 years ago, nothing was built for universal design. Everything had steps, everything was narrow, everything had a step within the house, and accessible housing is just non-existent, honestly. And I think as the population gets older, it's coming more and more to everyone's attention that people want to age in place, and they don't necessarily want to go to a nursing home. And so staying in home is that much more important. And unfortunately, we're behind the 8 ball, and it wasn't thought of until, I would say, within the last 10 years. And it's very costly to do those modifications, and financially, a lot of people don't have that ability to be able to make those modifications. Kind of like what Katie was talking about. That's a big chunk of money that has to come out of somewhere, and it's not readily accessible. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. And unfortunately, one of our panelists was unable to be here today, so I'm going to jump in, I guess, from the renter's perspective. As a young woman, I couldn't afford a house at that time, so I was looking for apartments to rent and found a list of quote unquote accessible housing in the Toledo area. Unfortunately, I found that a lot of it was 55 and older communities, and in my 20s, that wasn't really where I was looking to live at that point. Although I do love Scrabble, but also the place that said they were accessible, kind of what you were saying, Jeremy. You check a box that says accessible, but then you go there and there's steps or something, things are too high or things. So I guess one of the things and some advice I would give when you're renting or looking at is you really need to get eyes on the exact house or the exact apartment unit that you're looking to rent, so you can see if it matches your needs. Even though it says it's accessible and it says it conforms to ADA standards, ADA standards are very general. So you need to figure out, is this going to work for me? Do modifications need to be made, or is it something that's just not going to work it out? So I think, for renting, it can be challenging finding something, especially if you're in the younger set, but really looking at the individual unit itself is the best bet for that. So next, we're going to go to question 4. Buying a home is often difficult and requires a lot of planning, especially for people with disabilities. And what tools do you find for housing, and what are some things potential home buyers should look out for? And we'll start with Katie for this one.
So again, for me, especially as I was thinking about purchasing a home, it was really important for me to, I was really fortunate to be able to stay with my parents, and they weren't charging me rent, which I am very grateful for. But because of that, I was able to start saving money and eventually save up enough money to purchase or put a down payment on a home. That's not to say that I still didn't have to take out a home loan. In going through the housing search process, having never done this before, I think I just went on Zillow and was starting to send out inquiries, and it ended up working out that I was able to get with a mortgage broker and get with a realtor, and they were kind of able to help walk me through the process. So I was really lucky with that. But I think doing your research and really, finding a mortgage that works well for you, but also making sure you are able to save up money for a down payment. And again, for those modifications, I forgot to mention earlier, and besides putting a ramp on my home, I did have to remodel my entire restroom because, like Jeremy said, I have a walk-in shower. It's not a roll-in shower, but there was no way I was going to ever be able to get in and out of a bathtub. So I had to make sure that the entire bathtub was taken out and grab bars were put in the bathroom before I could even move in. So not only saving to put a down payment on a home, but saving if you know of any modifications that you'll have to make. Like Adrienne said, you know, there are different types of modifications. It's not just modifications for people with physical disabilities, but also thinking about those who are deaf or hard of hearing, or blind or low vision. They often have modifications that they will need to make to the home as well.
Thank you. Adrienne, would you like to share?
Oh, I think a lot of what you said, Valerie, is very true in this, you know, in this question, because, you know, like you said, you know, most people when they're looking to buy a new home, they'll start on like a web search. And, you know, a lot of times, even when you go on apartment.com, for example, or Zillow, if there is anything about accessibility, most of the sources is referring to wheelchair accessibility only. So most of like apartment.com and some of those other housing websites that are out there, if they do have anything that's accessibility related, it's usually a person, a wheelchair option. Not to say that they're actually accessible for wheelchair users, but they don't usually cover the wide spectrum of disabilities that are out there. And so, you know, the web search is a challenge itself to really narrow down, okay, which house or which apartment do I want to look at? And I think that the other thing to keep in mind when you are potentially buying a home is not only your current needs that you have, but also think about, you know, if this is a place that you want to spend your life at, what are some of the challenges or some of the barriers that may come up in the future? So somewhat, you know, doing a little bit of future planning as well, when you're looking at potentially buying a home can help. And some of those things, like I, you know, try to look at a lot of different scenarios. And so I might be looking at it from, you know, the eyes of someone who has a physical disability and wheelchair access. I might be looking at it from the standpoint of what if I lose my vision? Or as I get older and I start to lose my vision, is this potential home going to be a place that I can adjust and make it accommodate my new onset of disabilities or whatever that is. You know, a lot of things around, you know, the cognitive, the lighting, the noise of the home. Transportation is a big one. I don't think a lot of people think about when they're buying, potentially buying a home. You may potentially be able to drive at this, you know, at this time. But if anything were to happen in the future, and you're unable to drive, what is the public transportation that's around that potential home that you're going to be purchasing? So I really, you know, honestly, I know that this webinar is really around or focused around people who do have disabilities and their challenges in purchasing homes. But I really do encourage anybody who's looking to purchase a home to step outside of their comfort zone and look at all the variety of different issues and challenges that people may have, and look and see how that home can be adjusted to fit those needs.
Thank you. Next question is, affordability, housing shortages, and lack of accessible housing have made it more difficult for individuals to find a home over the years. Have you found that accessible housing costs more, and how has that impacted your housing search? And we'll start with Jeremy for this one.
What was the last part of it?
It says, have you found that accessible housing costs more, and how has that impacted your search for housing?
Well, I guess as we all know, inflation is here to stay, and The cost of making any of these modifications is gone through the roof. I think the part of, what was the last part of the question?
How's it
Sorry.
impacted your search for housing, I guess?
When we were searching for a house, we had to think of, we're going to have to ask for more money than what we're going to have to pay for the house, because we have to make those modifications. Like I said, ramps up to the house, or landscaping that's going to be able to raise the grade up to the doorway. You know, all that's going to cost, you know, say like 10,000 easily for just maybe a ramp. But then you're adding up costs on how do I widen a doorway? How do I make a bathroom accessible? You know, there's just, you know, if you need, these are all me specifically, but for all different types of disabilities, I mean, there's grab bars, or there's, you know, kitchen. How do you modify a kitchen if you need countertops that are lowered? So everyone's search is going to be different, but having the means to be able to add to the cost of a home that you're already going to be buying, but trying to minimize it as much as you can. I think it all varies for everybody that's going to be doing the search, but you really have to put the time and the due diligence in when you're doing those searches. And just it stinks to say that you have to, you don't want to hope that you find one that's going to kind of work for you. You want to find something that's going to work without having to do much work to it. But unfortunately, I hate to say it, it's not the case. So you just really have to do your due diligence and plan on having to spend more to make those modifications in the long run.
And Jeremy, you talked about what your needs, and that there would be kind of a lot of modifications to existing homes. Is that what eventually led you to just starting from the ground up?
Exactly, because it didn't make sense to put a bunch of band-aids on a house that might work, instead but designing something that was going to work for every need that I needed, and then I wouldn't have to do it ever again. Hopes, you know, assuming that, you know, my disability changed, but at the time being, I could plan for if anything changed, but getting everything I needed at one time and making it all cohesive. And it was much more practical to go that route than it was to do some things here and there and just not have it work the total way that I needed it to.
Thank you. Adrienne, would like you to answer this question too.
I think that you're going to find that, you know, accessible housing nowadays costs more. Or let me rephrase that. I do think that if you have a home and it's an older home, it's going to be expensive to make that home accessible. I do think that there has been, or my hope is, there has been a lot of focus on inclusive design, universal design. And so my hope is that, you know, as new homes are getting built, that universal design is being considered or taken in consideration in the new home, so that in future generations, having accessible housing is not going to be a challenge from a price cost standpoint. That, you know, eventually the future generations are going to have a more variety of options on houses based on the universal design process that, you know, a lot of universities are starting to take on. But I think the other thing that you must consider in this is that it's also the quality of your life and how, you know, how you want to live. And I think that, you know, in my situation, it makes sense for me to financially pay to make this home accessible to me. Because the cost, you know, my happiness and my emotional well-being far outweighed the cost of what it's going to cost me to make this home accessible. So I do think that there is, you know, another factor other than just cost that you have to look at and evaluate.
Valerie, if I could just add to that, it is also, I mean, obviously our well-being and our mental well-being and being able to move around within a home or getting into a home. But for me, the more I dug into it and the more I realized that after my accident, being immobile and not being able to do anything for myself initially without having any arm or leg function is the people who are caring for me. So initially it's like, yeah, it's all about me, but really it's also has a huge amount to do with who's taking care of me. How is it going to affect them? How is it affecting the people that are living there as well? And the care, you know, my aides that are coming over to help me, you know, do they have the proper spacing to do the job properly? Is there spacing for, you know, you have your own space to get away from, you know, having your own space to go and get away from family members or aides to have your own time? Or, you know, do you have enough space to use a Hoyer lift? You know, there's a lot of things that come into play that also are outside of your realm. It's also making sure you identify those needs of those that are going to be with you all the time.
I think that's a good point and good addition. I'd like to add that you, me, and Katie can probably understand this. Sometimes when we visit others' homes, you might be able to get in, but then you're kind of trapped in a space because either it's a split level, there's narrow hallways, there's people all around, you don't want to get in everybody's way. So for me, even transitioning from a crappy one-bedroom apartment that, yeah, I could get into, but wasn't super accessible, to a home where I can get rid of all my carpet and have, you know, wider hallways and places where I can get everywhere in the house was so freeing for me. And just to be able to have that level of independence and freedom so that I wasn't just trapped or unable to get to places, you know, in my own home. That was really important to me as well. Okay, we'll go on to the next question. Many people with disabilities report instances where they were denied housing or accommodations when looking for a place to live. Have you seen instances of housing discrimination, and can you speak to ways where someone might be able to overcome such barriers? And we'll start with Katie.
So as far as for myself, I've been fortunate that I have not been discriminated against in finding housing, but you know, it is definitely a challenge, and I think we touched on this briefly because this in itself is somewhat discriminatory when you go to search for housing, especially on like housing sites like Zillow, and you search for accessible housing. The housing that you're going to find, it's not accessible, and oftentimes you know, and I was really fortunate with my realtor who was very willing to kind of help show me houses that I wasn't able to physically always get into, but I think that can really be a problem too, in, you know, finding people that are willing to work with someone with a physical disability who is trying to find a house and taking that extra step. When it comes to renting, I've never had any issues with renting, but I have heard, you know, some other issues, you know, of people not even being able to get approved for an apartment because of worries that, you know, they're going to damage the apartment walls because they run into the walls with their wheelchair, something like that. And I can attest to that. I've done that. And I've had landlords that have been very forgiving. But, you know, I think it's important for people with disabilities to, unfortunately, be their own self-advocates in these situations and, you know, really push for their right to, you know, affordable, accessible housing, and, you know, not take no for an answer. But it's hard when the onus is on you as the person with a disability to, you know, assert your rights, because oftentimes that's the last thing we want to do is draw attention to ourselves. But if we don't, then we won't get what we need.
Thanks. This was Angie's question too, so I'm going to jump in just for one instance, again, just trying to find accessible apartment living that wasn't 55 and up was quite a challenge. But I remember when I was in college, I lived in the dorms, and at that time, it was a few years ago now, but they funneled every person with a physical disability, at least all the ladies, to one floor on one dorm. So it was like most of a floor of disabled ladies. And it was, I remember they didn't want to give me a roommate. For some reason, they thought, well, you don't need a roommate, you're in a wheelchair. But that was an experience that I wanted to have. So I had to assert myself and say, hey, I know this isn't your policy, but I'm cool with having a roommate. And it ended up working out fine, but that was something that I did have to advocate for. And luckily, as the years went on, new housing was built that did have accessible rooms on every floor. But it's just something that you might not think about, you know, okay, there are accessible places, but you're all going to be in the same spot. It's all going to be, you know, you can't live where you want on campus. You're going to be in this dorm. So unfortunately, that's still prevalent on a lot of college campuses, but I think it is getting better.
I can speak to that too. I was an athlete at a university, and all the athletes were staying, all the freshmen were staying in one dorm. But I had to stay at a different dorm so that I could have the accessible features that I needed in that dorm room. So, you know, my hope is that, you know, because that was 20 years ago, I'm hoping that things have changed. But I do think that a lot of times, you know, people don't realize that those scenarios can happen, and how they go about in addressing it can really make a difference. You know, sometimes I wonder, you know, well, what was the problem if the freshmen that were in the other dorm just stayed at the same dorm that I was in, you know, or, you know, are there other ways that we can make this work, instead of just setting the person with a disability kind of on the side in their own little thing. So, you know, I do think that, I'm sure it happens today. I think that my personal recommendation is to take a step back and maybe realize that people are unaware that it's a scenario that is happening, and then try to find ways. A lot of times people will just say, well, this is how we're going to have to do it. And, you know, sometimes it's just a matter of being creative, thinking outside the box, and providing potential solutions or options that might work for not only yourself, the person with disability, but for whoever else that you might be wanting to live with, for example. So I definitely can relate to that story.
We got one more question, and then we'll open up to questions. I see one in the chat, but feel free to put some in not the chat, the Q&A, and we'll be happy to answer those at the end. But the last question's for everybody here. Can you share one change that would assist individuals with disabilities in finding adequate housing? So we'll put you on the spot again, Katie.
Oh goodness, one change that would assist individuals with disabilities in finding housing. I think having more accessible options from like more accessible new construction without people with disabilities having to ask for that construction and not having it be in only 55 and older communities, because there's a huge group of us that are much younger than 55 and would still like accessible housing. So, and housing that's accessible from the get-go. So that would be my change, is to think about universal design when you're doing new construction so that anybody could make that home their own and they don't have to design their own home or make it accessible for themselves.
Thanks. Adrienne?
I can't really say any better than that. I mean, Katie kind of, really addressed that. I think, I certainly would encourage, if you are looking to find adequate housing, definitely reach out to your community. Obviously the Ability Center of Greater Toledo is available. They're a great resource to help assist. They, I think they definitely are interested in trying to make the community inclusive. So, obviously from, the architects, the construction, those kinds of, jobs, definitely expanding your awareness on universal design, getting the universal design certification, universities, partnering with the universities, make sure that universal design is a college class for those that are, majoring in architecture. So I definitely think that are things that are in the movement of hopefully supporting the future generation. I definitely think that with individuals with disabilities, the biggest thing that you can do, or the thing that you can do to make it impactful, is to speak up, to identify and to communicate the kinds of things that you need. And then also to realize that it's not just for the people who have a disability today, that eventually, 1 in 4 people are going to have a disability at some point, whether it's temporary or situational. So, I think it's important that as a community, we start to make those strides together, and realize that as a community, we're providing a positive experience by providing accessible housing.
Thank you. Jeremy?
Valerie, I'm going to have you repeat it again just for fun.
Sure. Can you share one change that would assist individuals with disabilities in finding adequate housing?
I think what we've been talking about with the being able to search through having some type of search engine that can help better find housing would be huge for so many people, I think. But it's tough because I think that's kind of twofold, because you don't necessarily have housing out there that's very accessible. So even if you maybe have a search engine that you can maybe actually solidify that the housing is accessible, I just don't think there's that much accessibility out there. So maybe that comes after what both Adrienne and Katie were talking about, like, and what I dealt with was finding builders that designers that are including these type of floor plans in their presentations and options to people. When you come across a lot of these builders, they don't have universal design as part of their options. They don't necessarily have zero entries, maybe not even wide doorways. I mean, that's something they might think as an afterthought, but I would say the education through a lot of these developers in Northwest Ohio, and even in the country, they need to understand that this is going to be a benefit to all people, and it really is not. It's not going to hurt them as a builder to incorporate this with their business and their options to the people that they're selling to. So I think the education would probably be the biggest thing that I would change with these builders.
And Jeremy, just to kind of go back to what you said about, having a database, I think, you and Adrienne talked about, different specific needs, maybe audio visual cues versus a roll-in shower, whereas I do better with the tub shower. I think having specific accessibility features and described on whatever database is, so that it's not just, oh, this is accessible, because what's accessible for you might not be for somebody else. So I agree. And I think that, being able to describe what features are in your home, apartment, condo, whatever it may be, would be very helpful. Now we're seeing with that housing market boom, people were buying houses without even seeing them. And if you have a disability and you have things that might need to be modified, you can't do that. That's a huge, huge risk. And you may have bought a lemon if that happens. So being able to identify these are the features that you have. I know I've been looking at houses, not even for myself. And a lot of even on Zillow, they'll have, 20 photos of the house, but no photos of the bathroom. Well, that doesn't help. You can't figure out what you need. So I think being able to identify specific accessibility features is a plus, again, whether you're an apartment site renting or whether you're designing a new home and you want to market it. Okay. Couple of questions here. Let's go with the first one here. Speaking of taking a long-term view, I wonder if we could set up a modified homes bank program in each city where, upon the passing of an individual living in a home that's been modified, the family has an opportunity to swap their modified home with a family that does not, but has a need for one with small tax breaks. Would be curious about the panelists might think of some sort of initiative. So a modified homes bank. What do you think? Anyone want to jump in here?
I guess I'll jump in. I think having a bank of modified homes, we'll just say some local organization is kind of a center point for accessible homes, or that can take on what people would think as a modified home, or a home that has any type of accessible features to it. I think that could be huge. Because in my instance, my accident happened at the drop of a hat, right? And instantly, you're looking for, oh, well, I need a home that's going to be able to accommodate this new disability. Where do I look? How do I start searching? Or, to have a place where my family could go to and say, hey, these are the things I'm going to need. Do you know of anything? I think that could be great. I think, and maybe a swap, that's an interesting curveball. Finding somebody that maybe you have a home that you may need somebody else's home that would work better. It's an interesting thought. I don't know what else the panel thinks on that point, but
I like your idea of a central point to where these homes could be identified. So someone looking for accessibility features could find them. I also think one of the challenges is that a lot of times when either someone passes away or you're selling homes, you think, oh, you know what, we need to remove these modifications in order to appeal to a wider audience. So a lot of times, even without thought of marketing to, people who may need the features, and I understand that may be a challenge as well, people go ahead and remove those features in order to appeal to a wider audience.
I think it's a great thing for like a temporary solution as well. I mean, in my parents' situation, my mom needed some changes made to the house, but she needed a place to go temporarily because we had to completely renovate the bathroom. She didn't have another bathroom on the first floor. And so, you know, when you're in those transitional periods, there's been, you know, that idea is very appealing because in a lot of situations for the home where they're older homes and we're trying to fix them to be accessible for the family, it usually does require them to either sign a temporary housing situation while the home is under renovation, or B, they have to kind of live there with the renovation going on. And that can really affect somebody's emotional and mental well-being. And so I definitely see an appeal for doing this, especially in those in transition.
Just a couple of, oh, Katie, go ahead. Do you have something?
No, I was just going to say, so going back to what you were saying, Valerie, because I have thought about if I ever put my home up for sale, you know, do I remove the modifications to make it more marketable? And I hate, as a person with a disability, that I even have to think that way, because obviously I would want to be able to keep the modifications so that somebody who needs them is able to use them. And I think having a centralized point where people can kind of go to search for accessible housing, I think could be really beneficial for something like that.
Couple of comments in the chat here. One says, suggest doing this webinar for architectural schools and via construction trade organizations to start education and increasing enrollment to the general public. We hope some of those people are on this webinar, but certainly getting the word out is a good suggestion. And somebody else has a comment here, says, I work in a program that targets persons with disabilities. We strongly encourage developers to offer virtual tours and floor plans on their websites. I think we can all agree that would be great to be able to see every inch of the house, basically, would be awesome.
Yeah, I think the one thing there is that some people will offer it, but then it's not accessible. So, you know, my hesitation there is to make sure that those virtual tours and floor plans are accessible. You know, whether that's somebody, you know, that has low vision and are blind, being able to assess, you know, be able to assess those things is important. So I think it's a great feature. We just need to make sure it's accessible.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just touch into it. Like one of the things, the reason why I chose to build was because in doing my due diligence and speaking to multiple builders, no one had any idea about any type of accessible building. You know, when you do a zero entrance, you have to do the foundation differently than what you would do typically for a house with multiple steps. And there was a lot of features because of ADA that they didn't necessarily want to dive into because they didn't know the code, or they wouldn't be able to easily just build the house real quick and move on. They had to do a little bit more education on themselves, and I don't think a lot of the builders were willing to do that. So that's why I decided to take it upon myself. And luckily, my family is in the business of remodeling and building, so I was able to tap into that and do it myself. And I'm blessed to have that. But I also understand that a lot of people, majority of the people out there, don't have that access to that type of, or would be able to do that. So that's why I think it's that much more important to, you know, I think if we're finding a couple builders, you know, in each community that would be willing to take that on would be huge. In that way, you know, we could slowly make a turn into universal design as being more common and as a benefit and to these builders and when they're selling their homes.
All right, I see Katie's jumped in. Katie?
Yeah, any more questions, Valerie, or is it time to wrap up?
That is all the questions.
So I just want to thank our panelists. I have had the opportunity to work with everybody in this room today, and I'm always amazed by their insight and appreciate you guys being here and volunteering to share your experience, you know, with the folks who are watching. And thank you to everyone who's attending this session. Our next session is, and our final session for the ADA seminar is tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Our Community Partnership Award winner, Dr. Larry Clark, will accept the award on behalf of the Monroe Street Neighborhood Center for the Bluff Street Village, which is their project to create tiny homes in our own community. Like I've said in previous sessions, they were willing to work with us from the very beginning to ensure that every tiny home that they have produced has an accessible floor plan. So we'll be excited to hear him talk about that. And just, you know, thank you to everyone who's here, and we hope to see you tomorrow for our final session.